6. Freiligrath and Lassalle. Ferdinand Freiligrath was 8 years older than Marx, and in his youth he had been liberally suckled with the pure milk of orthodoxy. On one occasion he had felt the lash of the old Rheinische Zeitung for having published a mocking poem on the unsuccessful tour of Herwou after the latter's expulsion from Prussia. However, it had not been long before the pre-March reaction had turned Saul into Paul, and during the period of exile in Brussels he had made the acquaintance of Marx. Their acquaintance in the beginning was slight but friendly. A nice fellow, interesting and modest in his attitude, he declared of Marx, and he was no bad judge of character. Freiligrath himself was utterly free of all personal vanity, and perhaps just for this reason he had a fine feeling for anything which suggested arrogance in others. The acquaintance of the two men ripened into a firm friendship in the summer and autumn of 1848. And the thing which drew them together was the respect which each felt for the courageous and uncompromising fashion with which the other represented their joint revolutionary principles in the Rhenish movement. Referring to Freiligrath, Marx declared in a letter to Weidemeyer, "He is a real revolutionary and a thoroughly honest man, and that is praise I would give to very few." At the same time Marx advised Weidemeyer to flatter the poet a little, declaring that all poets needed a little flattering encouragement if they were to give of their best. Marx was not a man who wore his heart on his sleeve, but in a moment of tension he wrote to Freiligrath, "I tell you frankly that I am not prepared to lose one of the few men I regard as my friends in the best sense of the word merely on account of unimportant misunderstandings." Apart from Engels, Marx had no better friend than Freiligrath in the times of his worst troubles. Because this friendship was so simple and so real, it has always been a source of annoyance to the Philistines. Sometimes they declared that the passionate fantasy of the poet had played him a scurvy trick by leading him into bad company. And at other times they declared that a demoniacal demagogue had breathed poisonously on a harmless poet and shriveled up his song. It would not be worthwhile to waste a word on this nonsense, but for the fact that a wrong antidote has been offered against it. An attempt has been made to turn Freiligrath into a modern social democrat, and this puts him in a wrong light. Freiligrath was a revolutionary from passionate instinct and poetic feelings, and not out of any scientific considerations. He regarded Marx as a pioneer of the revolution and the Communist League as the revolutionary advance guard. But the historical arguments of the Communist Manifesto always remained more or less foreign to him, and above all, his glowing fantasy could make nothing of the often miserable and sober petty details of the everyday agitational work. Ferdinand Lassalle, who joined Marx's circle at about the same time, was a totally different type. He was 7 years younger than Marx, and up to that time his reputation was based exclusively on his zealous struggle on behalf of the Countess Hatzfeldt, who had been ill-treated by her husband and betrayed by her caste. In February, 1848, he had been arrested on a charge of instigating the theft of a deed box, but on the 11th of August he was acquitted by a Cologne jury, after putting up a brilliant defense, and he was then able to devote himself to the revolutionary struggles. With his unfailing sympathy for all real strength, he naturally could not fail to be deeply impressed with the leader of the revolutionary struggle, Marx. Lassalle had also gone through the Hegelian school and had thoroughly mastered its methods without up to that time harboring any doubts as to their infallibility, and without being affected by the decadence of Hegel's successors. During a visit to Paris he had made the acquaintance of French socialism and received the accolade of a great future from Heine's prophetic vision. However, the great expectations which the young man had aroused were hampered in their development to a certain extent by an ambiguity of character which he had been unable to master completely in his struggle against the impeding heritage of an oppressed race. The stale atmosphere of Polish Judaism had prevailed absolutely in the home of his parents. In his championship of Countess Hatzfeldt, even unprejudiced spirits were not always able to appreciate the truth of his contention, justifiable from his own point of view, that in this individual case he was fighting against the social misery of a whole period now lumbering towards the grave. Even Freiligrath, who was never particularly fond of him, spoke contemptuously of the wretched domestic trivialities around which world history seemed to revolve for him. 7 years later Marx expressed himself in much the same fashion. Lassalle considered himself a world conqueror because he had been ruthless in a private intrigue. As though a man of any real character would be prepared to sacrifice 10 years of his life on such a bagatelle. And several decades later Engels declared that Marx had harbored an antipathy towards Lassalle from the very beginning, and that the Neue Rheinische Zeitung had deliberately published as little as possible about the Hatzfeld case in order to avoid any impression that it had anything in common with Lassalle in the matter. However, in this respect Engels' memory was deceiving him, for in fact up to the day of its suppression on September 27 the Neue Rheinische Zeitung published very detailed reports of the trial of Lassalle in connection with his alleged instigation of the theft of the deed box. Although of course its reports did not conceal the fact that the whole affair had less agreeable sides. And further, Marx himself, as he informed Freili Grott in a letter, assisted Countess Hatzfeld financially in her dire straits from his own modest means, and when, after his Cologne period, he got into serious difficulties himself, he chose Lassalle, apart from Freili Grott, as his confidant in a town in which he had many old friends. But Engels was certainly right when he said that Marx harbored an antipathy to Lassalle, and he and Freili Grott did also. It was an antipathy which had little to do with reason, and there is sufficient evidence available to show that Marx did not let it blind him to the deeper significance of the Hatzfeld affair. Not to speak of the fiery enthusiasm which Lassalle showed for the cause of the revolution, his outstanding talents and finally the devoted friendship which the younger comrade-in-arms showed towards him, it is necessary to examine carefully the development of the relations between the two men from the beginning. Not on Lassalle's account, his historical claims have long ago been vindicated, but in order to shield Marx himself from misunderstandings, for his attitude to Lassalle represents the most difficult psychological problem his life offers.